I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
Well, welcome. My name is Michael Allegretti, and I'm Vice President for Programs here at the Manhattan Institute and Director of our Center for State and Local Leadership. And it's a real honor to have you all with us here today. And I'd like to take a moment at this time to welcome hundreds of viewers, actually, who are watching this event online live at publicsectorinc.org, as well as each of you. It's evidence of the growing importance and attention being paid to this issue of public sector pension reform. And I want to remind all of you, both in the room, but more importantly online, that you can follow the online conversation on Twitter at #SaveOurCities. As the title of today's event should make clear, Save Our Cities, Reforming Public Pensions to Protect Public Services, the debate about public sector pensions is about much more than retirement security. Instead, we must view this issue more broadly through a broader lens and examine the impact of the current public pension status quo on the quality of life in our cities, on the taxes that we pay so dearly, and the services that we rightly deserve. When an ever-increasing share of government revenue is devoted to paying for an ever-escalating public pension benefit, these are promises that are made by politicians who have long since left public life and who never accounted for how these things would be paid for. Our quality of life suffers. When the trade-off means that a hospital must close, a classroom must go without needed supplies, a garbage pile must sit on the street for an extra day or perhaps a week, a park or a library must reduce its hours, or a road or a bridge must go unrepaired, we all suffer, perhaps even fatally. Furthermore, when the trade-off means that we can hire fewer public employees because a decreasing share of workers are getting an increasing share of benefits, public workers themselves, and for that matter, their unions, also suffer. Now, today we have what I think is a very exciting program that will look at these issues, and it's aimed at giving you, the reformers, the tools and the arguments to be successful in effecting positive change. As part of this program, we have released 3 reports on public sector pension reform. The first is called Quantifying Crowd-Out by Manhattan Institute scholar Stephen Eide. It puts facts and figures, which are often missing from these arguments, behind the fact that increased pension spending is leading to decreased services in places as diverse as Baltimore, Detroit, Los Angeles, and others. The second, by Marcus Winters, called Better Pay, Fairer Pensions, Reforming Teacher Compensation. That piece takes a deep dive into one aspect of public employment, and that's public school teachers, showing that the current public pension system doesn't just not serve students well, it actually doesn't serve the teachers all that well either. And the final report, 20 myths, not 19, 20, so it takes a few minutes to read it. 20 myths about public sector pension plans. This is by Rick Dreyfuss, and this is a must-read if you're serious about pension reform. It helps you to see what really counts as reform and what's simply window dressing. All 3 of these reports are available online at manhattan-institute.org, and of course, also in your packets today. In a moment, Howard Husock, my colleague, will lead a conversation that examines exactly how public pensions are crowding out the quality of life in our cities and the services that leads to that quality of life. Later this morning, I'll lead a conversation that examines the options on the table to fix the problem. And finally, and perhaps most stimulating, we'll hear 2 personal stories. The first is by a Republican who made reform happen in deep blue Michigan in the 1990s, and the other is by a Democrat who's making it happen right now in even deeper blue California. It's exciting. It's important. The faces of leadership are as important as the message. Now, throughout the day, I'd like to remind you to think about questions you have for the panelists and for the keynote speakers. And to our viewers online, you can tweet your questions directly to @ManhattanINST. That's @ManhattanINST, and we will work to get your questions, both the online ones and the ones in the room, into our conversation. With that, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Howard Husock, Vice President for Policy Research at the Institute. Howard?
I'd like to invite our first panel members up to take their places. And good morning. Thanks, Michael. I'm Howard Husock, Vice President for Policy Research at the Manhattan Institute. And as Michael said, today's conference is premised on the idea that pension and other employee benefit costs have increased at such a substantial rate that cities and states find themselves with decreasing funds available to provide the crucial services which citizens expect. For those of us who believe that our cities are the key drivers of the American economy, this is no small concern. Indeed, the problem has become an ongoing part of news coverage of our great cities. As the New York Times wrote just yesterday of Chicago, corporations are moving in, housing prices are looking better, there's been a slight uptick in population, but a crushing problem lurks beneath the signs of economic recovery in Chicago, one of the most poorly funded pension systems among the nation's major cities. But how serious and crucially, how widespread is such a crisis? To what extent are services truly affected? Our first panel today will look at these specific questions. Our speakers have all written extensively on the pension issue. Joshua Rauh, to my immediate left, is professor of finance at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business, where he teaches the course, The Finance of Retirement and Pensions. His publications include the 2011 paper, The Pension Bomb. Next, to his left, E.J. McMahon, director of the Empire Center for New York State Policy and a senior fellow in the Manhattan Institute's Center for State and Local Leadership. He's the author of Iceberg Ahead, The Hidden Cost of Public Sector Retiree Health Benefits in New York, and Optimal Option, SUNY's personal retirement plan as a model for pension reform. Both of those can be found online at the Empire Center's website. Marcus Winters, an economist on the faculty of the University of Colorado and a senior fellow here at the Institute, is the co-author of the recent paper, Better Pay, Fairer Pensions, Reforming Teacher Compensation. Finally, Stephen Eide of the Institute's Center for State and Local Leadership is the author of the just-published paper, Quantifying Crowd-Out, The Experience of 5 Cities. We begin with Professor Rauh, and let me start by asking you a question. The bankruptcy of Detroit can lead to the view that there are a few bad apples out there that really are in trouble, and that's where the issue is most focused. I'm going to sit down and let you talk, but what do you think?
Well, thanks very much for inviting me to be here. I guess my view of that is when you have the beginnings of an epidemic, say, an illness, that illness usually hits the people who are already sick first. But that doesn't mean that the epidemic isn't going to hit a lot of other people as well. And I think that that's what's going on with cities, and Detroit is really, in a sense, the canary in the coal mine. It's the first major city to really, have the largest city to have a bankruptcy that was really driven heavily by their legacy costs. Of course, we've had a number of California cities that have done municipal bankruptcy. When I look at the data, and I've recently done a study where I look across the 20 largest cities in the U.S. Contributions to public employee pension systems across these 20 cities have risen dramatically in the last 12 years. So I go back to 2000. In the last 12 years, they've gone up from about $50 per capita per year on average to about $250 per capita per year. But the reality is that even those contributions are not enough to reflect the economic costs of the pensions. And what that means is that still not enough is being contributed, and that means that these contributions are destined to rise even more unless very fundamental reforms are actually made. Very interesting article in the press recently about Chicago the last couple of days. Mayor Rauh has said that, has pointed out something that those of us who've been following Chicago for a long time know, that in 2015, property taxes would have to double in the city of Chicago to pay the pension bill, because they basically implemented a pension holiday so that they could keep spending money on things now and then, putting off the problem to the future. So this is a critical problem that is affecting cities and state governments across the U.S. And the constant cost mismeasurement that's going on has just led to the problem getting worse and worse and worse. And I think that is one of the key points, is that the costs of these public employee pension promises are still not properly being reflected in government budgeting. And as a result, there is really no state or local government across the U.S. That sponsors any kind of defined benefit pension plans. That's most of them. There is no state or local government across the U.S. that has really run a balanced budget in an economic sense in a very long time, regardless of what their own governmental accounting says.
And mismeasurement, maybe you could define a little bit what you mean by mismeasurement for those who don't follow municipal finance.
Sure. So as a finance professor, there's a very troubling aspect to the way that pension costs are measured in state and local governments. And the way that they're measured is sort of dictated by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB. This is the governmental version of FASB. GASB is mostly comprised of representatives of the state and local governments themselves, so it would be a bit as though if the FASB board only consisted of CEOs of companies as opposed to representing shareholder interest. So GASB tells state and local governments to discount or measure the costs and the present value of their liabilities, assuming an expected return on the assets in the pension fund. And this is very troubling to a finance professor, because sort of the first thing that you could teach in finance and an MBA program like Stanford is that you can't measure the value or the cost of a liability based on some assumption about the returns on the assets you choose to fund that liability. And the reason for that, if you think about it, is that there's just too many degrees of freedom one could have, right? One could say, well, I'm going to fund this liability by investing in some investment that I think is going to have 10% compound annualized returns, and I'm just going to therefore kind of assume that this isn't really a liability because the assets are going to grow to meet the liability. But that's what the state and local governments do. It's not as bad as 10%. Now it's around 7.75%. So essentially, budgeting at the state and local government level for pensions is done under the assumption that every dollar that goes into the pension system is going to earn a 7.75% per year compound annualized return. So that means, the money is, every dollar is going to double every 10 years or so. And under those assumptions, state and local governments are asserting that their budgets are balanced. But those are not assumptions that would fly in any kind of private sector accounting. In fact, I think anybody who tried to do that would probably be hauled off to jail. But in the government sector, that's the way the accounting works. That was illustrated in one very stark way that I often do. Suppose you had a friend, and the friend loaned you $100,000, okay? And he said, I'm your friend, there's going to be no interest, but you're going to have to repay me in 10 years' time. Okay, so you have a debt to this friend, $100,000 is due in 10 years' time. Say you take half of the $100,000 and you spend it on a car, okay? Pretty nice car, 50 grand, you get something okay, not like a top of the line luxury, but pretty nice car. You take the other $50,000, you invest it in the stock market, okay? Now, the stock market has historically, if you go back to 1900, has had compound annualized returns of around 10.5%. And that's because we've lived through, this is one of the greatest, bull market centuries for the stock market in history that's ever been documented. So essentially what the governmental accounting would allow you to do is it allow you to say, okay, I borrowed the 100 grand, I spent 50 on the car, the other 50 I'm investing in the stock market, and because that is invested in this asset that has historically grown very quickly, I'm just going to assume that in 10 years' time, that $50,000 that remains after I bought the car will equal $100,000, and I will be able to repay my friend. And therefore, when the bank asks me to write down, on a form how much debt I have, or if I apply for a mortgage, they ask me to disclose how much other debt I have, I'm just going to write down I have zero debt. Because, of course, I bought the car, I'm enjoying the car, and then the other $50,000 is in the stock market, and it's going to grow to pay off my friend, so I'm just going to say that I have zero debt. In the private sector, you simply can't do that. But in governmental accounting, you can, And that's to me, one of the primary reasons that we've gotten into such trouble. The temptation to do that and to therefore shift the costs of providing public employee compensation onto future generations has just been too tempting in a context of having to present balanced budgets. It's too easy to say we're not going to pay in real compensation today, we're going to pay in deferred compensation, and we're going to not properly measure the cost of that deferred compensation so that when the future comes, the future taxpayers will have to pay twice. They will have to both pay for the services that they're going to consume in real time in the future, and they'll have to pay for the legacy costs that we didn't properly fund.
Or something would have to give.
Or something would have to give.
Thank you, Professor Rauh. E.J. McMahon of the Empire Center. E.J., in New York State, as I understand it, we are not in an underfunded situation. We've actually been diligent at both the state and city level about making the ostensibly required payments to finance pensions. Does that mean we don't have a problem here in New York?
No, it doesn't mean we don't have a problem in New York. It is worth pointing out that the most acute pension problems you hear about in states and cities across the country, for instance, the states of Illinois and Connecticut and New Jersey, are a result of a failure over many years to pay the required contributions. So, as Josh was pointing out, the required contribution actually is too low. It's based on a sort of an accounting fiction that governments are allowed to use. And these governments have not even been making that contribution. Now, the focus on those types of problems has led some people to assume that, well, the problem really has been the failure of these governments to contribute, and if only they had contributed, everything would be okay. New York illustrates the very high cost of the system in another way because, as you noted, Howard, the city and state of New York pretty much try to keep up with and are required by past court rulings and interpretations of the state constitution to make their annual required payment, their annual required contribution. Well, the cost of that's been very significant. In just the last 10 years, starting in fiscal '03, the total increase in pension contributions to the New York State pension system and the New York State teacher system, which cover all public employees outside New York City, other than New York City employees, has risen $6 billion. Now, that's several multiples of what it was in 2003 when it reached a low. So that's $6 billion outside New York City. New York City's pension contribution to its pension funds during the same 10-year period has also risen $6 billion, actually close to 6.5. So you have an increase over the last 10 years actually of nearly $13 billion at these two levels of government in pension contributions. So that represents a very significant version of the crowding out effect that you're talking about. That's a very significant amount of money. And again, that leaves these systems, this is what's necessary to get these systems to the status of, quote, fully funded, unquote, by government accounting rules that Josh has just explained aren't quite accurate. But there's a whole other problem in addition to that that's related to the pension problem, but not recognized as much. And that is the fact that state and local governments across the country, and to a particularly expansive degree in New York State, promise all of their employees who work for, usually the standard is about 10 years before retirement, they get continuing employee health coverage when they retire. And that's promised to those employees. So just as you're promised a pension, you're promised continuing health insurance coverage. Except unlike the pension, at least a large portion of which is pre-funded through these increasingly expensive pension funds, retiree health insurance is not pre-funded at all. So there's a net present value to that promise. We have promised everybody who now works for, say, the City of New York, and everybody who just retired from the City of New York, that they're going to continue to receive health insurance coverage, which for the City of New York means by and large you don't have to contribute to it, for the rest of your lives. When you reach Medicare age, the employee policy becomes a supplement to your Medicare. In fact, the city and most of the state of New York and most of the local employers in New York even pick up or reimburse for employees the so-called Part B premium, which is a nominal amount that the federal government requires people to pay, which is means tested, as a way for people to have skin in the game, as it were. Well, the total amount, the total value of this promise is enormous. We've estimated that for the state of New York, the city of New York, and all the public authorities of New York and local governments, that the total value of the retiree health insurance promise is $250 billion. Now that's an unfunded liability of $250 billion. Not a penny has been put away anywhere to fund that. That's totally paid for on a pay-as-you-go basis now. There are some cities in New York already, particularly, for instance, Syracuse, Buffalo, I believe Albany may be one now too, that are now spending more every year on health benefits for retirees than they spend on health benefits for active employees. So they're in the same situation that the big three automakers were and have been for a while, which is that they have growing legacy costs that they have not pre-funded. And this is a whole other set of problems in addition to the pension problem that's not sufficiently recognized. And it's basically a debt that's been passed on to the future. And it's also a problem for employees. I know that our focus today is protecting the public and protecting taxpayers and public services. But the problem with this approach to, for instance, employee health insurance is it's not protecting employees either. Because in fact, already Chicago is talking about eliminating or severely curtailing retiree health coverage. And in the cities in the greatest economic and fiscal stress, Stockton and Detroit, they're going to eliminate it. And it's going to be the first thing to go if a serious problem ever arises in New York City or in any of these other localities. And employees don't fully realize it. And unfortunately, both elected officials and union leaders are basically turning a blind eye to it.
Didn't mean to lean in so strongly, AJ, but thank you.
That's it.
Well, that's an interesting theme, that employees may not be as well protected as they appear to be. And Marcus Winters, why don't you pick up on that, because you've looked specifically at that in the context of teachers' pensions.
Right. So in my paper with Josh McGee, we're looking at so of course a lot of this conversation is about the unfunded liabilities part and the cost of pensions. And what we're looking at in our paper is the other side of it that sometimes gets lost on this, which is the benefits side of the equation. And in particular for teacher pensions, and we look at the largest 10 school districts in the United States, we want to look at the structure of pension payments and think about who benefits from the way that the pension funds are distributed and who doesn't benefit under the current system. And when we think about pensions, and I think if you talk to teachers, we usually talk about large potential payoffs at the end of retirement, right? And I think if you ask a lot of teachers, they tell you that their pension wealth is probably the best thing about their compensation system, right? That they earn relatively low salaries as far as they're concerned, but they get a large pension payoff at the end. But the problem is that the system can only provide these relatively large pension payments at the age of what is called normal retirement for teachers who make it to that age by redistributing money from teachers who leave much earlier in their careers. Teachers who leave their school system early in their careers are usually leaving with very, very little pension wealth. And by redistributing that wealth to teachers who do stick around for a working lifetime is how we were able to offer them those relatively high pension amounts. So what's going on here is that pension wealth in all the systems that we looked at, though it varies by degree, and I think across the country, are heavily backloaded into teacher compensation. So for instance, in New York City, and New York City actually is not where we found had the biggest problem, but we're in New York City, and it's a nice example. The first about 20 years of your career as a New York City public school teacher, you earn on average about $3,000 in retirement wealth, in essentially employer-sponsored retirement wealth, the equivalent of about $3,000 a year for those first 20 years. The next 18 years, if you stick around in the system, you earn the equivalent of about $33,000 for each of those years, right? So instead of smoothly accruing pension wealth as you go through your career, you earn very little pension wealth in those first 20 to 25 years that you're a teacher, and then much, much higher careers of pension wealth later on in your career. Well, why is that a problem? Well, if you're someone who's certain at the age of 25 when you enter into New York City or some other public school system, if you are certain you're going to work in that school system for the rest of your working life for 30, 35, 40 years, then this system's great for you, actually. It actually allows us to offer a pretty large large amount. But that describes very few young people ever, I think, and certainly today. Very few of us know, one, that they're going to stay in teaching at all for a working lifetime, and two, that they're going to stay within that same school system. In fact, teacher attrition is very, very high, particularly in early years. And we see this in the pension plan's own assumptions. So by our calculations, what we do is we calculate pension wealth at different ages if the teacher decided to leave. And then we also look at the pension plan's assumption on how many teachers are going to make it to these different parts, which is something that they have to assume so that they can fund these plans going forward. And so New York City's plan, which is actually pretty conservative relative to the other place we looked at, they assume that only about a third of teachers are going to make it to the point where they're going to maximize their pension wealth accrual. In other systems, it's much, much worse. In Philadelphia, what we calculate as maximizing pension wealth accrual, they assume only 7% of teachers are going to make it that far. In Hawaii, it's only 5% of teachers. So those teachers, if you stick around in the system until that age of normal retirement, you really benefit from this. But the vast majority of teachers just don't. So this is not only something that the systems know about. This is something they count on in order to fund these plans and pay the higher pension rates to teachers who stick around. So the majority of entering teachers don't really benefit from this. And again, if we were only talking about Teach for America teachers who are there for 5 years or so and leave, we don't want to give them bad pensions, but that wouldn't be the worst problem in the world. But we're talking about teachers who have been in the system for 20 years. So in New York City, we calculate the net present value of your retirement wealth after 20 years is only about $60,000. If you're in that system. Now, what if your spouse wants to take another job in the Midwest, right? You're leaving the school system, even if you remain in teaching, and you're leaving a lot of pension money on the table. So we suggest in our paper a more smoothly accruing system, where essentially teachers earn a consistent percentage of their salary as part of pension wealth, instead of this system that has these huge steps within them late in their careers. It's going to eliminate the severe backloading. We show that this would offer higher pension wealth to the majority of teachers, and in some school systems, the large majority of teachers. What this would do, this would reduce the maximum amount that we can offer teachers at the age of normal, if they stick around to age of normal retirement, by allocating more money to the teachers who leave earlier in the system. But what it's going to do is reduce that maximum amount by providing a more secure retirement path to the majority of teachers in the system. The plan that we model in the paper is completely cost neutral, right? So we're actually not speaking anything to the unfunded liabilities part, which of course we have to. We have to speak to it policy-wide. But what we're modeling here is a really cost neutral plan, just when teachers receive their money in their career. And it can also be done within the defined benefit structure as well. There's nothing inherent in defined benefits that say that you have to provide give money to teachers so late in their career. So this is something that I think, again, the benefit side of this equation we have to think about, because, again, I think this is a problem that teachers themselves don't really understand, right? They think that they are on a very secure retirement path with their really great pension plan, and what it turns out is the majority of them are leaving the system or leaving teaching well before they reach an age where they actually benefit from the structure of the current system.
Marcus, that bridges the discussion to the quality of services, which I'm going to ask Steve Eide about in a moment, but most of your work focuses on education quality issues, and I wonder if this backloading problem that you've identified, the fact that teachers have to stay for almost 30 years in many systems to really get the full benefit of the current defined benefit pension system, concerns you in terms of teacher quality.
Not particularly, right? So one of the arguments for having this backloaded type of system is that it's going to keep teachers in the classroom, right? It's a retention tool, right? And now the first problem with that is it just seems wrong that we're going to use as a retention tool, essentially holding teachers hostage with their pension security. But even holding that back, the idea, so again, we're not just talking about teachers who are new to the classroom. We're talking about teachers up to 20, 25 years that are there. Research provides us absolutely no reason to believe that a 30-year teacher is any better than a 20-year teacher, is any better than a 10-year teacher, and in fact is any better than about a 5 or 7-year teacher. What we know from the years of experience is that, as far as teacher quality, is that you're the worst teacher you're going to be the first year in the classroom. You get better for the first about 5 years, and then you essentially plateau after that. So there's no particular reason that we need a plan that's focused on such high retention rates among teachers who have been in the classroom for a very long period of time.
So it doesn't improve teacher quality as it's currently structured.
No, there's no reason to expect that it does.
Right. Let me turn now to Steve Eide and a discussion of his paper about what we're calling crowd out, that is the triage between pension payments and other city services. And Steve, you've looked at this in a number of cities. Why don't you talk about your findings?
Yeah, well, when we talk about crowd out is a fiscal problem that results when a major spending item grows at a rate annually above that of overall revenues. So, for example, in the past decade, nationwide, for local governments, pensions and healthcare costs have annually grown at a rate of about 7 to 10% annually, whereas revenues, overall revenues, have grown at a rate below 5%. Compounded over time, that creates a big problem. That's crowd out. In terms of services, cities have to balance their budgets. They can't run deficits. So when benefits costs go up annually, some other cost has to be reduced. In services, cities really are in the service industry. I mean, city budgets are very simple things in a way. It's important to understand that. We pay taxes to hire people to keep us safe, to educate our children, to keep the streets clean, and so forth. Like contrasted with the federal government, which operates major distributionary entitlement programs, weapons systems, and so forth, that they have major costs that cities don't have. Most of a typical city's budget goes towards personnel costs. So when you have pressure on budgets from the revenue side or spending side, personnel costs is where you see the effect. So headcounts is the clearest way to see the effect of services, on services of crowd out. In the recession, local governments in America lost 580,000 jobs. They have only yet gained back about 50,000. And they started gaining them back way later than the private sector. In the private sector, the recession era induced job losses were deeper. A greater share of the workforce was reduced. But the private sector started gaining back jobs in early 2010, whereas local governments, only this year did they start gaining back jobs, and very, very slowly. The services that city governments provide are K through 12 public education, public safety, police and fire, public works, and also kind of quality of life services like libraries and parks. Certainly different cities have responded differently. They have cut differently. In LA, for example, I know that they have been actually increasing the number of cops during the crowd out era, whereas in New York City, the number of police officers is way down over the past decade or so. I mean, it's important to, when we're talking about this issue of pension costs and crowd out, not to get trapped into arguing that in and of itself, because governments are employing fewer workers, that's necessarily a bad thing. In the wake of the early 90s recession, there was this fashionable term right-sizing, debate about right-sizing government. I mean, obviously, how much we spend on services, the size of government should be driven by need, not just, for example, what we used to do, past experience. Like, for example, fire departments. In many cities have overstaffed fire departments. They have probably more firefighters than they need, given how many fires they have. And in that, tax pension costs are now preventing cities from hiring more firefighters. It's not clear to me that that's a major problem for taxpayers. So the right-sizing argument is, I think, important to keep in mind when we're talking about crowd out, the now fashionable term, or we hope to make it one. Well, another service that I've actually been focusing on recently is libraries, something I just have a personal interest in, I guess. But as a quality of life issue service, I think it's very important to keep in mind because, well, first of all, it's the last in line when budgets are put together. First of all, the cities focus first on core services, education, public safety. And so certainly in New York City, the cuts to libraries are way deeper than the core services. Still, and the library budgets are still way down. But it's the type of thing as a quality of life service that we do expect to get better as the economy improves. And that's the problem with crowd out, is that even though the economy has been improving, the quality of services has not been increasing. And library budgets are still down. Staffing hours and so forth. They haven't been getting any better because revenues are up somewhat, but costs for pensions and healthcare are up even more, and so you don't have the revenue you should have to devote towards services. The last thing I want to emphasize about services and thinking about the impact on services of crowd out is actually on salaries. Marcus didn't talk about this, but in his paper he looks at, he raises the question of how much more teachers could be making in terms of salaries as opposed to if they weren't getting these benefits, these pension benefits. And certainly if you look at city budgets, you also see this crowd out effect of as benefit costs have been rising, salary costs have been actually shrinking. And it's very important to raise the question, I think, of whether or not, that's a good idea. Do we need, even when in the debate about whether or not public employees are overpaid, generally speaking, there are very few people out there who think that teacher salaries are excessive. I mean, the benefits are another question, but even very strong critics of a public sector compensation would probably be open, I think, to having higher salaries. Obviously, I think for younger employees, higher salaries matter more. Insofar as you've been seeing, furloughs, zeros, in recent years because of pension costs. It's bad for morale for current employees. And just to come around to the point, you would attract a higher caliber of worker if you could increase salaries and thus get better quality of services, but you can't in an era of escalating benefit costs and flat salaries in local government.
So that's a theme that's emerging, Steve, that employees themselves may not be well served by the current pension finance requirements. I want to press you a little bit on the libraries issue that you mentioned as a key example. Is that the most important issue, or are you putting it forward as a kind of emblematic of the quality of life services that you saw cut in the cities that you studied, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Boston, Baltimore?
Well, I didn't find a clear pattern in terms of which services have been cut the most. They did seem to make different decisions. But one thing I learned about in studying libraries and meeting kind of library services advocates is that the people who are upset about library cuts tend to be kind of very single issue types. They're relentlessly focused on this one thing they care about, and they just have no concept of the bigger picture of the way that budgets works and the way that which, it's not because Bloomberg hates libraries that library funding is down. It's because these, what he characterized as uncontrollable costs for pensions and healthcare have been forcing his hand. And so that's why, even though there's a very high level of public awareness about the pension problem, there's still, if you look at, these advocacy groups and what they're focusing on, many of them still haven't gotten the message. They still don't understand that if this is what you care about, you really need to understand, pension underfunding as a library issue.
EJ, you raised this issue of OPEB, other public employee benefits, to wit, unfunded health care. What I got out of that is that you could imagine or characterize municipal budgets, municipalities all across the country as being effectively bankrupt, right, because of obligations like that. Do you see it that way? And then I want Josh to come in and see whether you think widespread bankruptcies are actually in the offing.
I wouldn't say they're bankrupt. I'd say they're much deeper, and I wouldn't paint with a uniform brush, because there are differences in the level of benefits offered in different municipalities across the country. For instance, California, which everybody tends to cite as the poster child for bad practice or out of control or poorly financed benefit compensation structures, actually has traditionally had lower retiree health benefits or a lower replacement rate than New York has had. The West, it tends to be lower in the West than in the East, go figure. I think that what the new GASB, the Government Accounting Board rule that shows you what these promises cost, has done for us, it's basically shined a spotlight on an entirely, on a whole area of debt, which essentially is indebtedness. You've made a promise, not to bondholders, but to employees, and that basically it means that municipalities and states that have done this are more deeply in debt than they appeared. Now, for instance, New York City, to cite one case, is in a state of what accountants would call balance sheet insolvency.
Balance sheet insolvency. That's a more polite term. So, Josh, does that lead us to think that we're going to see Detroit-style crises, whether we call them bankruptcy or not?
Well, I think it actually has a lot to do with the extent to which cities are going to try to raise taxes to pay for the problem, and then how robust the tax base ends up being to those attempts to raise taxes. It does seem out where I hang out in Silicon Valley, I mean, there seems to be, to me, a shockingly large acceptance of the idea that taxes can increase and businesses will still be there. Well, I don't know. What I also observe is that people make a lot of money there, and then they take that money and they bring it someplace else, like to Texas, and do something else afterwards. So I think the question is really how robust are these city tax bases going to be to attempts to solve this problem, and not just tax increases, but also the kind of spending cuts and the crowd out that Stephen was talking about before. It's interesting. Just a couple of thoughts listening to these great this commentary about these great papers that the other panelists have written here. And one of them is regarding the crowd out. I also looked a little bit at crowd out in a new paper that I have. Looking across these 20 cities at the increases in contributions, and I looked at whether the increase in contributions across cities was correlated with the amount of public safety cuts, or the amount of police force cuts and fire force cuts. So in essence, I was looking at whether cities that had to increase contributions more to pensions were also cutting fire and police forces more. And I know that in Stephen's paper, he points out that both New York and Los Angeles have actually, cut the number of policemen on the streets, in the face of budgetary pressures. Well, I found more of the fire forces getting cut pretty quickly, and in sort of correlation with these contribution increases. And so I think the question is, what's going to be cut? What exactly are the strategies that mayors are going to have for cutting one type of service or another? And then I also want to just come back to Marcus and to ask you maybe just say a little bit more about just what a bad deal these pension systems are for young teachers. I mean, I know, I lived in Illinois for 8 years. I know of the Illinois teachers' retirement system. So if you start as a new teacher in this system, you have no Social Security. Okay, first of all, they're not in Social Security. Second, they're the lowest end of the pay scale for this entire system. They've got a weaker pension benefit than the other guys, and it's basically a pension benefit they're never going to get, because they have to pay 9% or 10% of their pay into the system that's basically a black hole for them. And also, they're not really in control of their own destiny, because when school systems have to do large layoffs, it's often done on the basis of tenure, how long you've been there, not how good of a teacher you've been. And we've all heard of these examples of people winning teaching awards and then getting fired because they were part of the, they were too junior to survive the cut. And so I want to know, how do we flip this, what I call the attraction and retention debate, to make young teachers understand that they are getting a really bad deal here. What we keep hearing from other people is, oh no, we need to have these DB plans to attract teachers. Well,
it's defined benefit.
Yeah, defined benefit. We need to have these defined benefit plans to attract teachers. And I'm thinking we need to make sure that the young teachers understand that they are bearing a huge burden here, and that this is just it's a very bad deal for them to be beginning in these defined benefit plans.
Right. So that's an interesting theme that's emerged from this discussion, which was focused on crowd out and the loss of services. And we've seen our panel also point out the bad deal for younger employees. Marcus, you want to weigh in very quickly, because I want to get to audience questions.
Just to say that, just for how bad it is, it's very bad for young teachers. And I think you're right politically, because one issue I've been thinking about and talking to kind of some political scientists and thinking through this issue, one problem facing this politically for these systems is that the few teachers who remain in the school system, who know that they're going to stay in the school system for that 35 years or so, these are the people who are very heavily involved in the union, who are very heavily involved in designing these plans, and are very active politically. And the younger teachers are the ones who might not be, and they're the ones that are really losing out on these plans. And somehow they have to be made to understand just how bad this system is for them. And again, we're not talking about just 5 years or so. You can spend time as long as 20, 25 years in these systems, and if you leave them, you leave with very, very little retirement wealth. So Mike Prigurski and Bob Castrell, who've written on this issue a little bit, call it golden handcuffs, that basically you want your pension plan, but in order to have it, you can't move from one system to the other, and you can't exit the system. You can't exit teaching. if you do, the cost of what you're going to lose in your pension is just really dramatic. And again, I think you're right. I think this is something that young teachers just really don't understand about their wages. And I think if you ask them, they would tell you that their pension plan is great. And that's something we have to get around.
Howard, if I could just leapfrog on that real quickly, just to make
Okay, very quick, because I do want to
but-
get to questions, Steve.
No, just that the fact that so many teachers leave the profession so early is explains why average pension figures are so low. Like oftentimes when you see cited in the press, the average pension that system is only $25,000. That's because so many people are leaving before they accrue the full benefit, and it doesn't really reflect the actual generosity of the benefit.
Great. All right, let me get some audience questions. In fact, we've got some online questions. My colleague Kasia Zabavwa can bring them to us.
This is from Liz Farmer of Governing Magazine, and Josh, directed to you. Can you elaborate on why government pension accounting is so bad compared with the private sector? And part two, why is it bad to assume that past rates of return will continue?
Well, the way that this government pension accounting is done with these expected returns on assets is really completely at odds with anything that's done in the private sector. In corporate pension accounting, under FASB, there are some ways that expected returns on pension assets affect income statements. But at the end of the day, I mean, the corporate pension accounting has been regulated. The funding rules have been regulated for a very long time by the ERISA laws and the laws that followed that. And
ERISA stands for?
The Employee Retirement Income Security Act, going way back to 1974. And what ERISA put in place was a system where these corporate pension plans would be insured by the federal government, but also then that the companies had to actually fund them. So what that's led to is that corporate pension plans are still they are actually also in dire shape for different reasons now, but they're not in as dire shape as the state and local governments. However, the federal government has an explicit liability for the corporate plans, which I can talk about later if people are interested. But the question was, why is the accounting so bad? Well, the accounting is so bad because of this assumption that every dollar that the state and local governments put in, they're just assuming that money is going to double every 10 years. And under the assumption that the money is going to double every 10 years, there would be enough money in the pension system to pay pension costs for those local governments that say they're 100% funded. I mean, there are many that say they're not 100% funded, but there are many that almost all of them are not 100% funded under their own rules. But the idea is that it's only in balance if the money is going to double every 10 years. That's nobody in the private sector can do that. You can't say I don't have any debts because my assets are going to double every 10 years and they're going to pay my debts off. So that to me is really the crux of why the accounting is so bad.
Although to reinforce what you said before, you made the point that there's an incentive on the part of elected officials, I think that's what you were saying,
yes,
to adopt this kind of wishful thinking accounting, if you want to call it that.
There's definitely incentive to do that because accepting the reality that you can't do this would mean you would have to immediately say to everybody, yeah, actually these systems are much worse funded than we thought. Now the other part of the question was, why can't we assume that historically realized returns in the stock market will continue going forward? And that just goes to I can start out with the old adage that, past performance is no guarantee of future performance.
And your mileage may vary.
And your mileage may vary. Past performance is no guarantee of future performance, but these pensions are guaranteed. They have to be paid no matter what happens with the assets. And if you look at, we do a lot of financial modeling. If you put standard finance assumptions into a simulation, we call it a Monte Carlo simulation. You simulate out potential future paths of the stock market. What I find under the most standard assumptions that people use today is that achieving an 8% compound annualized return on pension assets over the next 30 years is about a 75th percentile outcome. So what that means is, if you sort of think about all of the future possible states of the world we could experience, good, bad, medium, what have you, this is an outcome that would be met around 25% of the time. And so basically state and local governments are doing budgeting under the assumption that a very rosy future is going to be achieved. They're doing budgeting under the assumption that basically a 75th percentile outcome is going to be achieved, and on that basis they're saying the budget is balanced. Now, I think it raises a very interesting public choice question, which is, well, first of all, how much stock market risk should state and local governments really be taking on? I was under the impression that one of the roles of government was to smooth out the bad times. If they're taking on all this market risk and all this risk that's positively correlated with the economy, then they're basically setting us all up for these double whammies that we experienced during the financial crisis. The assets in the pension funds tank in value, people lose their jobs, and the government say, oh yeah, and by the way, our obligations have gone up too to the public employees, so taxpayers, you have to contribute more into the system. To me, from a risk management standpoint, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that our governments are taking such risk in equity markets on our behalf. And then the second question is, if they are going to take risk in stock markets on our behalf, then if they're going to actually do this, if they're going to invest in equities in pension funds, then to what sort of point in the distribution should they be targeting? I mean, I said before that they're basically targeting a 75th percentile outcome. Well, should the government be saying we're fully funded if the median outcome obtains, or if or should they be more conservative? Again, my thought is that government's supposed to be there to smooth out the fluctuations, not to exacerbate the fluctuations. And so therefore, one should be fairly cautious in allowing governments to assert that the budgets are balanced when they're taking on these large distributions of risk.
And so there really aren't rules. They can make their own assumptions as it stands now, is what you're saying.
They can make their own assumptions, and the assumptions have been very sticky from the past. So I mean, these 8% return assumptions have been there for a long time. They want some credit for having reduced them recently to around 7.75% in many cases. But this has gone. I mean, Mayor Bloomberg had a good quote about this. I think he said it went from ludicrous to ridiculous or laughable. I can't remember the exact word. He had two words. We'll look up the citation.
I just know there are a lot of people who work within about 20 blocks of here that would die for 7.75%. I know that. Questions from the audience? Yes, sir, on the left, right there. Wait for the microphone if you would, and if you tell us who you are, we'd appreciate it. Can't quite hear you.
My name is Harvey Yashevsky. I have a few questions, if I may.
Why don't we start with one in the form of a question, and we'll take it from there.
I'll certainly start with one.
Go ahead.
I guess the most interesting thing to me on the presentation was the negative impact of these pension systems on the employees themselves. Isn't it fair to say that that the requirements on private corporate pension systems, for example, on ERISA, as compared to government pension systems, is that the discrimination is taking place against the public employee, because under ERISA, the employee's pension would have to vest in a much shorter period of time, and the employee would be entitled to the money in full if they left after 5 or so years. So that this is really highly discriminatory by governments against employees.
Right. So is the system that is advocated by those representing public employees actually discriminating against public employees? EJ, do you want to weigh in on that?
Again, on that point, the standard approach, I think, in public pension systems, certainly the case in New York, is that if you leave a system before vesting, you get back what you've put in with an interest rate, which is not usually the system's expected rate of return, but you get back what you've put in. Now, of course, most of what is contributed to the pension funds is not contributed by the employee, it's contributed by the employer, and you don't get back what the employer has contributed. So, for instance, in a time when the employer, if the so-called normal rate, the theoretical rate for a normal steady state universe in your pension, for your pension benefit, would be 12% a year from the employer, you don't get that 12% a year back when you leave before vesting, you only get back what you put in, which, for instance, in New York State in these systems is maybe 3% a year. In fact, we did a calculation on this in our report recommending that teachers be given access to the very long-established 50-year-old system that higher ed has in New York and higher ed has in most states, which is an annuity-based defined contribution retirement account, typically a TIAA-CREF account, in which if you left after 5 years, you would leave with a fairly substantial start on a nest egg that you could take with you. And by the way, the issue about teachers and younger teachers maybe not understanding the issue here, we did a poll of teachers in New York State, a statistically valid poll that found that a large majority of teachers, public school teachers in New York State, would favor being given the option, that is a choice between a traditional pension and the higher ed defined contribution account. In fact, the more senior teachers, by a slightly larger margin, thought that that was a valid choice. They understand. I think that you need to give them credit for understanding more than you might think. So, but I don't think it's also true that the system is bad for everybody who's in it. If you're a lifer in government and you put in the whole time, you don't go anywhere, you're walking away, you retire earlier than your neighbors in the private sector with a bigger guaranteed tax-free pension in New York than they have. I mean, that's a pretty good deal, and it's guaranteed by the state constitution here. The problem is the way the whole system works ultimately is unsustainable. So I wanted to summarize something that was one of the points Josh made and the other speakers have made. The real problem with the status quo, this is that a classic defined benefit pension, that is a retirement plan that guarantees you a benefit based on your final average salary and how long you've worked, that guarantees you that check every month no matter what. The problem with that, especially when it's heavily based on investments that are heavily in equities in the stock market, is that it demands the most of the taxpayers and of the citizens at a time when they can least afford it. It is pro-cyclical.
Pro-cyclical, yeah. Exactly.
That is, when you have a downturn and when you have a great recession, you have a great crash in pension fund values, and you have to start coughing up a lot more money when you don't have it. That's a feature, not a bug. That's the problem. There's two solutions to that. The solution, if you want to have a defined benefit system, is to have a much, much, much more expensive defined benefit system that is invested in a very cautious way in low-risk investments that requires a much larger contribution rate to make good on the promise, and it's thus somewhat less variable. The other solution, of course, is to have a defined contribution system, and then the discussion.
And our second panel is going to explore those kind of things. So I think the answer is it's especially discriminatory to the extent that it is toward younger employees whose labor force mobility is quite inhibitive of that. Real quick, Josh, I want to get in one more question before our
I just want to comment real quick. I mean, you mentioned the annuity-based, pooled defined contribution account, which is what the sort of TIAA-CREF offers. I hope that at some point today, maybe now is not the right time, we can discuss that benefit structure a little more, because I think in terms of being able to give young public employees an alternative to say, here's what you should ask for, I think that would be one thing that would be something we should consider telling them to ask for. Something like an annuity-based pool defined contribution account where they will get an annuity when they retire. It'll be based on how well the assets perform. They don't have to manage their own money. So I think the problem is, it sounds like we're saying these DB plans are really bad. Are we telling the young teachers they should ask for a 401k? Well, 401ks have also not been a huge success in guaranteeing the retirement income security of a lot of Americans either. And so I think that we want to think about some of these alternative models for them. I think a pooled defined contribution account, which creates no unfunded liabilities but does provide an annuity upon retirement, would be one thing to consider.
Well, that's a great point at which to stop, because it segues us to Governor Engler, who is going to talk about how he approached reform and different choices in Michigan, and to our second panel, and to Mayor Reed, who is grappling with exactly these issues in San Jose. So please join me in thanking our panel.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.